Welcome back to Mildly Interesting and Sleepy. The night is settled now. Whatever the day brought, it is behind you, and this is the part where you let it go. You are warm or you are comfortable, and there is nothing you need to do right now except be here and let the words move past you slowly, unhurried. Tonight we are going to spend time with a man who lived in Athens about 2400 years ago, who never wrote a single word, who owned almost nothing, who spent his days wandering the city's marketplace asking strangers embarrassing questions about things they assumed they already understood, and who was put to death by a jury of 500 of his fellow citizens at the age of 70 for crimes he did not quite recognize as crimes. His name was Socrates, and he is one of the most consequential human beings who ever lived. The paradox of Socrates is immediate and worth sitting with for a moment before we do anything else. He wrote nothing, and yet he changed the way human beings think about thinking. He claimed to know nothing, and yet he is regarded as the founding figure of Western philosophy. He was by most accounts physically unattractive, famously compared to a satyr, the half-human creatures of Greek mythology, with a broad, flat nose and bulging eyes, and a stout barrel-shaped body that was apparently also remarkably healthy and physically resilient. And yet he attracted the most brilliant and beautiful young men of Athens who followed him everywhere and hung on his words and recorded everything they could remember of what he said. He was a private man, guided by an inner voice he could not fully explain. And yet he was profoundly and genuinely committed to public life, to conversation, to the shared and difficult work of trying to understand how human beings ought to live. These paradoxes are not accidents. They are part of what Socrates was, part of what made him so difficult to dismiss, and so easy to resent, and so impossible to forget. And they are part of why, 24 centuries after his death, we are still talking about him. Let us begin with the city he came from, because Socrates without Athens is impossible to imagine. Athens in the age of Socrates, the extraordinary city. Socrates was born around 470 before the Common Era in Athens, a city that was at that moment living in the afterglow of one of the more improbable military achievements in history. Within the lifetime of people still alive when Socrates was a child, Athens and the other Greek city-states had beaten back two massive Persian invasions, first at Marathon in 490, where the Athenians defeated a Persian force vastly outnumbering them, and then again in 480, when a Persian army under Xerxes that had burned Athens to the ground was defeated at sea at Salamis, and then on land at Plataea. The mood in Athens after these victories was one of enormous confidence, even of divine favor. Something important had happened, something world historical, and Athens was at the center of it. The confidence expressed itself in every direction simultaneously. Athens built the Parthenon, one of the architectural achievements of human civilization, on the Acropolis in the years of Socrates' childhood and young manhood. It developed and refined its experiment with democracy, a form of government so unusual and so internally contested that its architects were making it up as they went and arguing about it constantly, debating who should participate, how decisions should be made, what the relationship between the assembly and the courts and the council should be. Athens produced, in rapid succession, the great tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, each taking the form of tragedy in different directions, each using the mythological stories of gods and heroes to explore questions about justice and divine will and human suffering that the city had no other way to process. It produced Thucydides, who invented historical writing of a rigorous and psychologically sophisticated kind. It produced Phidias, whose sculptures set standards that the ancient world would measure everything else against. It was doing philosophy and mathematics and medicine at a level that had never existed before. It was also a city full of contradiction. The democracy Athenians celebrated was the democracy of adult male citizens, a category that excluded women, who had no political participation, and slaves, who constituted somewhere between a quarter and a third of the population, and resident foreigners, the metics, who could not own land or participate in the assembly regardless of how long they had lived in Athens or how much they contributed to its economy. The freedom Athens celebrated and exported as an ideal was, in practice, the freedom of a specific and not especially large class of people. The intellectual culture was equally paradoxical. Athens prized the free exchange of ideas and celebrated wisdom, and also put Socrates to death for exercising exactly these things. It hosted a vigorous tradition of philosophical and sophistic argument that treated traditional religion with considerable skepticism, and also prosecuted people for impiety when the skepticism became politically inconvenient. It produced both the world's first functioning democratic institutions and the world's first sustained philosophical critique of democracy as a form of government. It was a city capable of extraordinary self-criticism and ordinary self-deception simultaneously, which is to say it was a very human city. Socrates was a product of this city in the deepest sense, and a challenge to it in almost every way. He was Athenian through and through, shaped by its culture, committed to its people, devoted to its ideals in the specific way you can only be devoted to something you love enough to criticize. He described himself as a gadfly on the back of a great and noble horse. The horse was Athens, noble but inclined to doze comfortably in the afternoon sun, and the gadfly's job was to sting it into wakefulness, to keep it from the dangerous sleep of unexamined assumption. He genuinely believed this was a service to the city and to the god Apollo who had assigned the mission. He also believed, with clear-eyed self-knowledge that is one of his most characteristic qualities, that it would eventually get him killed. His father Sophroniscus was a stonemason or sculptor, a craftsman of genuine skill and modest prosperity. The family was not wealthy, but was respectable and had standing in Athenian civic life. His mother Phaenarete was a midwife, and Socrates later drew on this fact in one of his most characteristic philosophical images. The philosopher as a kind of midwife of ideas, helping to bring to birth what is already present in the other person, rather than introducing anything new from outside. His education was conventional for an Athenian of his social position. Reading, music, gymnastics, the foundation of civic and cultural life. He served in the military, as all Athenian citizens were expected to do, and served with distinction and unusual physical composure. He showed early gifts for argument and inquiry that set him apart from the beginning. For a time in his youth he was interested in what we would now call natural science, the tradition of inquiry that Greek thinkers had been developing for more than a century before him, asking what the fundamental nature of the physical world was, what things were made of, what accounted for change and motion. Thales thought everything was water. Anaximenes thought it was air. Heraclitus thought the fundamental reality was fire and flux and perpetual becoming. Democritus had developed a theory of indivisible particles, atoms, out of whose combinations all things were made. These were serious thinkers working on serious questions, and Socrates engaged with their work. Then something shifted, and he turned away from the investigation of the physical world toward the question that would occupy him for the rest of his life. Not what is the world made of, but how ought a human being to live. This turn from natural philosophy to moral philosophy, from the cosmos to the human self, is what makes Socrates the founding figure of Western philosophy as a discipline concerned primarily with human life and human values. The ancient philosopher Cicero put it memorably: Socrates was the first to call philosophy down from the heavens and establish it in the cities of men, making it a matter of life and character and the examination of good and evil. This is essentially right. Before Socrates, the dominant tradition in Greek intellectual life was asking what things were made of and how the cosmos worked. After Socrates, and because of him, the dominant tradition was asking how one ought to live and what justice and virtue and the good were. The oracle and the mission, a divine calling. The pivot in Socrates' philosophical life is connected to a story about the oracle at Delphi, and the story deserves careful attention because it explains the specific quality of his commitment to his philosophical mission, the quality that made it feel to him not like a career or a vocation, but like something he could not abandon even to save his own life. The oracle at Delphi was the most authoritative religious institution in ancient Greece. At the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi, a priestess called the Pythia sat on a tripod above a fissure in the rock and spoke the words of the god, sometimes clearly, sometimes in riddling verse that required interpretation. Kings and cities and generals consulted her before major decisions. Private individuals came seeking guidance on marriage, business, travel, all the uncertain ventures of ordinary life. The oracle's authority was pan-Hellenic, recognized across all the competing city-states, which made Delphi a kind of neutral religious ground in a world where most religious obligations were local. The two inscriptions over the sanctuary entrance summed up its wisdom: know thyself, and nothing in excess. At some point, a devoted friend of Socrates named Chaerephon went to Delphi and asked the oracle a direct question: was there anyone wiser than Socrates? The oracle said no. No one was wiser than Socrates. When Socrates heard this, he was genuinely puzzled, and his puzzlement was genuine rather than performed. He did not believe he was wise. He did not believe he possessed any significant knowledge about the most important things. The oracle's answer, coming from the god of truth and reason, had to mean something because the god did not lie. But what it meant was not obvious. He decided to investigate by the method most natural to him. He went to people reputed to be wise and examined them, and if he found that they were wiser than he was, he could bring that evidence to the oracle and refute the oracle's claim. He went first to the politicians, men who spoke with great authority and confidence about the good of the city, about what justice required, about how Athens should be governed. He engaged them in conversation. He found that when he questioned them carefully, they could not give a clear, consistent account of justice or of the good or of any of the important matters they spoke about with such confidence. Their authority rested on habit and social position and rhetorical skill rather than on genuine understanding. When pressed, they contradicted themselves. They did not know what they claimed to know. He went to the poets, men like Sophocles and Agathon, who had produced beautiful and apparently wise works. He questioned them about what their poems meant. He found that the poets could not explain their own work, that they composed under kind of divine inspiration or madness, that they could not account for or reproduce on demand, and that when they tried to explain the wisdom in their poetry, they said things that were confused or inconsistent or simply false. The beauty of the poetry was real, but its wisdom, if it existed, was not the poet's own. It flowed through them from somewhere else. And the poets, having produced beautiful things, made the mistake of assuming they were therefore wise about other things too. He went to the craftsmen, the people who genuinely knew something. The shoemaker knew how to make shoes. The blacksmith knew how to work metal. The shipwright knew how to build ships. These were real skills, real knowledge, and Socrates respected them. But the craftsmen had made an error characteristic of competence. Having mastered their particular domain, they assumed that their mastery extended beyond it. Because they knew how to make things, they thought they knew about the most important human questions too, and they did not. His conclusion was subtle and important and became the foundation of his philosophical method. He was wiser than all these people not because he knew more, but because he knew that he did not know. The politicians had false certainty. The poets had inspiration without understanding. The craftsmen had genuine knowledge in their domain and false confidence outside it. He had only his ignorance, but his ignorance was honest, a genuine recognition of the gap between what he knew and what he needed to know about the most important things. Honest ignorance, he concluded, was better than false certainty. This was what the oracle had meant. He was the wisest man in Athens precisely because his wisdom amounted to acknowledging it was worth nothing. He understood from this investigation that he had a mission, a divine assignment, given him by Apollo through the oracle to go about Athens questioning people, exposing false certainty, helping the city to honest self-knowledge by demonstrating the gap between what people believed they knew and what they actually knew. This was the service the god required of him. He pursued it for the rest of his life, for decades, with total commitment, at great personal cost, with no financial compensation, and with the clear-eyed awareness, developed early and never lost, that it would eventually make him enough enemies to kill him. The awareness did not slow him down. If anything, it gave his work a quality of deliberate urgency, the urgency of a man who has been told what he must do and who intends to do it completely. The Socratic method, questioning as a way of life. The Socratic method is one of those phrases that has entered the general vocabulary of educated life and lost some of its original sharpness in the process. People use it to mean asking questions in teaching or using dialogue rather than lecture or any kind of interrogative approach to learning. These usages capture something but miss the specific and rather radical character of what Socrates was doing. The process is called elenchus, from a Greek word meaning cross-examination or refutation. It has a specific structure. Socrates approaches someone who holds a confident view about something important, say, what courage is, or what justice is, or what piety is. He establishes the view clearly. He then asks questions about it, drawing out its implications, applying it to cases, examining whether the view is consistent with other things the person holds. The questions are designed so that the person's own answers lead them, step by step, to a conclusion that contradicts either their original view or something else they believe firmly. The conversation ends in aporia, in puzzlement. The person is no longer confident they know what they knew coming in and cannot say what they believe instead. The goal of this is not primarily to embarrass the interlocutor, though it often had that effect and was a significant source of both Socrates' following among young men who enjoyed watching powerful people be humbled and his hostility among the powerful people themselves. The goal is to clear away false certainty, to produce in both parties a genuine not knowing from which actual inquiry can begin. You cannot genuinely seek to understand something you believe you already understand. The elenchus is a method for getting people to genuinely seek. Socrates conducted these conversations with elaborate and deliberate irony. He would approach a renowned expert with every appearance of humble deference, saying he was only a confused and ignorant layman hoping to learn from someone so distinguished and wise. The expert, flattered and at ease, would begin expounding their views confidently. Socrates would express admiring appreciation and then ask a small, apparently simple question. Then another, then another. The questions would become less simple. The expert would find themselves in difficulties they had not anticipated. By the end of the conversation, the expert would often be in a state of considerable confusion and irritation, unable to defend positions they had come in confident about, uncertain of things they had been certain of, and frequently resentful of the person responsible for this condition. The irony was both genuine and strategic, and both dimensions were real. It was genuine because Socrates genuinely believed he had nothing to teach and was genuinely seeking to understand the most important questions through the examination. It was strategic because it was also, clearly, a very effective way of getting people to expose and examine their assumptions without triggering the defensiveness that would have shut the conversation down before it got started. Whether the combination was fully honest, whether the performance of humility in the service of a very assured philosophical project was entirely truthful, is a question about Socrates that has no clean answer. He insisted he was not a teacher and had no positive knowledge to impart. He refused to charge fees for his conversations. This distinguished him sharply from the sophists, who were professional teachers of rhetoric and argumentation, charging substantial fees and promising to teach young men how to argue for any position and win any debate. The distinction mattered enormously to Socrates. The sophists were interested in victory and in equipping their students for victory. He was interested in truth, and the method of the elenchus was a method for approaching truth, not winning arguments. This distinction was important and real, and it was also not always visible to his contemporaries, some of whom lumped him with the sophists as one more clever man who taught young men to outargue their elders. Aristophanes essentially did this in the clouds, with lasting damage to Socrates' reputation. The claim that virtue is knowledge, the Socratic paradox that generates the most philosophical controversy, follows directly from his commitment to the examined life. Socrates believed that if you truly understood what was good for your soul, truly understood it, and not merely believed it abstractly, you would do it. No one does wrong willingly. If someone acts unjustly or selfishly or cowardly, it is because they have made an error in understanding. They have mistaken what is truly good for what merely appears good. They have failed to grasp genuinely that justice is better for the soul than injustice, even when injustice would bring material advantage. This seems counterintuitive. We all know people who know very well that something is wrong and do it anyway. But Socrates would say that what those people have is not genuine knowledge, but opinion, not deep understanding, but surface agreement. Deep, genuine knowledge of the good, he thought, was transformative, not merely informational. It changed how you lived, not just what you said. The inner voice, the daemonian and its meaning. Among the more intriguing and philosophically significant aspects of Socrates is what he called his daemonian, his divine sign or inner voice, a spiritual presence that accompanied him throughout his adult life and that he described with characteristic care and characteristic puzzlement. He was precise about what it was and what it was not. It was not a god, not a full divine being, but something in between the divine and the human, a kind of intermediary presence. It did not tell him what to do. It only told him what not to do. When he was about to take an action that would be harmful or wrong, the daemonian would intervene, issuing a restraining signal that he described sometimes as a voice, sometimes as a sign, something he could not fully characterize but could not mistake when it came. It had been with him since childhood. It had stopped him from entering politics, most significantly because it foresaw, as Socrates thought, that political life would have corrupted him or led him to compromise the philosophical mission. This inner voice was one of the charges against him at his trial. Introducing new divine things into the city was among the accusations, and the daemonian was the primary evidence for it. Socrates tried to explain at his trial that the daemonian was not a new divine being, but something more personal, a form of divine communication specific to him. a sign rather than a theology. The jury was not persuaded, or at least not persuaded sufficiently. How we understand the daemonian depends enormously on the framework we bring to it. From a religious perspective sympathetic to the idea of divine communication, it is exactly what Socrates claimed: a genuine supernatural presence accompanying his philosophical mission and guiding it at crucial moments. From a secular psychological perspective, it looks very much like what we might call conscience or moral intuition, an extraordinarily well-developed, in a sense of rightness and wrongness, that operated below the level of explicit reasoning and expressed itself as what felt like an external voice. From a more skeptical perspective, it looks like a useful internalized authority that gave Socrates permission to refuse things he did not want to do on other grounds. What is most philosophically interesting about the daemonian is what Socrates did with it and what he did not do with it. He did not use it as an oracle, did not consult it for positive guidance about what to do, did not claim on its authority to have special knowledge about the most important questions. It was a restraining force only, a negative signal. Everything positive, everything about what justice was and how one ought to live and what the good was, had to be arrived at through the hard work of examination and argument. The divine voice said stop. The philosophical method said why and what instead. They were complementary, not redundant. The daemonian also reflects something important about Socrates' relationship with religion generally, which was unusual and sometimes misunderstood in his own time and after. He was not a religious skeptic in any straightforward sense. He believed in the gods. He prayed. He performed the appropriate rituals. He took the oracle at Delphi with complete seriousness and organized his philosophical mission around its pronouncement. He was, in his own understanding, serving Apollo as his primary purpose in life. But his religion was not identical to conventional Athenian religious practice. It was more personal, more interior, more connected to the examined life than to the prescribed performances of civic religion. This made him, to conventional Athenians, genuinely puzzling and potentially threatening. The circle, followers, friends, and the complex legacy of influence. Socrates attracted around him one of the most remarkable collections of intelligent people in ancient history, and the range and quality of that collection, combined with the variety of directions they went after his death, tells us something essential about what he was and what he offered. Plato was the most important, and we will spend a full evening with him separately. Plato came from a great aristocratic family, had planned a career in politics, encountered Socrates as a young man in his late teens or early 20s, and was so transformed by the encounter that he redirected his entire life. He gave up politics. He spent 20 years in the Socratic circle. After Socrates' death, he traveled, and eventually returned to Athens to found the academy, the institution that would be the model for all subsequent Western universities, where he spent the rest of his long life writing the philosophical dialogues that remain the primary source of our knowledge about Socrates and the primary foundation of the Western philosophical tradition. Whether the Socrates in Plato's dialogues is the historical Socrates, or whether Plato gradually transformed his teacher into a vehicle for his own philosophical system, is one of the most important and most contested questions in classical scholarship. Xenophon was a very different kind of follower, a soldier, a practical man, a historian. He also wrote accounts of Socrates, and his portrait is rather different from Plato's. Xenophon's Socrates is more down-to-earth, more interested in practical wisdom about running a household, managing subordinates, staying physically fit, being a good friend. Less interested in abstract metaphysics, less given to elaborate philosophical arguments about the nature of knowledge and the immortality of the soul. Some scholars think Xenophon's Socrates is probably closer to the historical man in certain respects, even if Plato's is philosophically richer. The truth is probably that both are partial, that the historical Socrates was complex enough to be remembered differently by two intelligent men who knew him personally. Alcibiades was perhaps the most complicated figure associated with Socrates, the one whose relationship with him says the most about both the power and the limits of the philosophical encounter. Alcibiades was brilliant, physically beautiful, enormously charismatic, and politically ambitious to a degree that eventually destroyed him. He rose to great influence in Athens, led the catastrophic Sicilian expedition that helped doom Athens's military position, defected to Sparta when charged with religious sacrilege, eventually returned, was celebrated again, then fled when things turned against him, and was eventually assassinated in exile. He was also, throughout all of this, a man who acknowledged that Socrates was the only person who could tell him what he ought to do and who consistently failed to do it. In Plato's Symposium, Alcibiades arrives dramatically late to the dinner party, drunk and crowned with ivy, and delivers a speech about Socrates that is one of the most moving tributes to a philosopher in ancient literature. He describes Socrates as like the Silenus figurines sold in the marketplace, ugly and comic on the outside, but open them up and they contain golden divine images. He describes how Socrates' words enter him like the music of Marsyas the satyr and leave him feeling that his own way of life is not worth living. He describes trying to seduce Socrates and being refused with perfect composure, as though Alcibiades' famous beauty was simply not a relevant consideration. He describes how he cannot stop thinking about Socrates and cannot bring himself to do what Socrates makes him know he should do. This combination of recognition and avoidance, of knowing the good and being unable to commit to it, is precisely the human condition that Socrates' whole philosophical project was designed to address. The sophists were Socrates' most important intellectual opponents, and the relationship between him and them is crucial to understanding what he was doing. The sophists, Protagoras and Gorgias and Thrasymachus and others, were professional teachers of rhetoric who traveled from city to city charging fees to teach young men how to argue effectively for any position. They were often brilliant and philosophically sophisticated. Protagoras claim that man is the measure of all things, that truth is relative to the perceiver, was a serious and challenging philosophical position. But they were interested in effectiveness, in winning, in equipping their students for success in the democratic political world. Socrates was interested in truth, in genuine understanding, in the examined life. The difference was not merely professional, but deeply philosophical, and Plato spent a great deal of his own philosophical career elaborating and defending the distinction. Courage in two registers, the soldier and the philosopher. It is easy to think of Socrates as primarily an intellectual figure, a man of words and arguments, and to forget that he was also a man of considerable physical courage, who had demonstrated it in the most demanding possible contexts. He served in the Athenian military during the Peloponnesian War, the exhausting and eventually catastrophic conflict with Sparta that lasted from 431 to 404 and ended with Athens's defeat, the destruction of its empire, and a period of brutal oligarchic rule. He was not a young man when the war began. He was nearly 40. He served at the siege of Potidæa, at the Battle of Delium in 424, and at Amphipolis in 422. These were real military engagements with real casualties, and Socrates participated as an ordinary citizen soldier. The most celebrated account of his military behavior comes from Alcibiades in the Symposium. At Potidaea, Alcibiades says, Socrates endured hardships that no one else could endure, going without food when supplies were short, and yet, when food was available, enjoying it more than anyone. He endured the Thracian winters, which were severe, without special protection, continuing to go barefoot while everyone else was bundled up. He once stood still, deep in thought, for a full day and night, from early morning through to the following morning, while his comrades came and watched him in fascination. At Delium, the Athenians were routed and fled in disorder. Alcibiades describes seeing Socrates during the retreat, walking calmly with Laches the general, looking around him with the same measured gaze he used in the Agora of Athens, making clear by his entire bearing that he would be a very dangerous man to attack. Alcibiades says that Socrates in the retreat was far calmer and more composed than Laches, who was a professional soldier. This physical courage was not incidental to Socrates' philosophy. He thought about courage explicitly and carefully as one of the most important virtues, and the Socratic account of courage as the knowledge of what is truly to be feared and what is not, rather than simply the absence of fear or the reckless ignoring of danger, was clearly something he embodied as well as theorized. He was not brave because he was reckless. He was calm because he had thought clearly enough about what mattered and what did not. That dangerous situations did not unhinge him. He had, in other words, done the philosophical work, and the philosophical work paid off in exactly the way he thought it should. His civic courage was equally remarkable and equally consistent with his philosophy. When his turn came to serve on the Council of 500, the body that prepared business for the Democratic Assembly, he served. During the trial of the generals after the Battle of Arginusi in 406, when the council was under enormous political pressure to conduct an illegal mass trial of the 8 generals who had won a victory but failed to rescue Athenian sailors from the water, Socrates was serving as the presiding officer of the assembly. On the day the matter came to a vote, he refused to put the illegal motion to a vote. He stood alone against the crowd and against the political pressure and against the explicit threats of those who wanted to prosecute the generals. He could have been killed for this. He made the refusal anyway because it was the just thing to do and because he was not going to participate in injustice simply because a majority demanded it. Then, under the 30 tyrants, when he was ordered along with 4 others to arrest a man named Leon of Salamis and bring him in to be executed, Socrates simply went home. He did not comply. He did not organize resistance. He just refused to participate in an unjust act and went home. The 30 had killed others for similar refusals. He was fortunate that they were overthrown before they got around to him. But the refusal was genuine, and the risk was genuine, and it was exactly what the philosophical commitment to justice over survival required. The relationship with Athens, love and criticism. The relationship between Socrates and Athens is one of the most complex and illuminating aspects of his story, because it is a relationship between a man who loved his city deeply and a city that eventually executed him. And both the love and the execution make complete sense given what each party was. After Athens' defeat by Sparta in 404, the city endured the period of the 30 tyrants, which was genuinely terrible. Hundreds of executions, confiscation of property, the systematic destruction of democratic institutions. When the democracy was restored, it declared an amnesty for acts committed during the period of the 30, which was politically wise and made reconciliation possible. But the amnesty could not erase the memory of what had happened, and it could not prevent the accumulated resentments of years of Socratic examination from finding an outlet. The 3 men who brought the charges against Socrates in 399, Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon, were not great thinkers or principled adversaries. Anytus was a democratic politician who may have had personal grievances against Socrates, or whose associates had been embarrassed by Socratic questioning. Meletus was a young poet, perhaps representing the literary community that felt Socrates had been disrespectful of their art. Lycon was an orator with professional reasons to resent the distinction between genuine wisdom and mere rhetorical skill. Together, they assembled the charges that were politically available: impiety, specifically for introducing new divine things, the daemonian, and for not acknowledging the city's gods, and corruption of the youth. The charges were not entirely without foundation, in the sense that Socrates had done things that could be framed these ways. The daemonian could be called a new divine thing. His association with young men who had gone badly wrong, Alcibiades and Critias most prominently, could be called corruption of the youth. But the real grievance was everything he had been doing for 30 years, asking the city's most prominent people uncomfortable questions in public, exposing the gap between their confidence and their knowledge, being an irritant and a disruption to the comfortable assumptions of civic life. The atmosphere of 399 was one of democratic anxiety, a city that had recently survived oligarchic rule and wanted to reassert its values and its cohesion. Socrates had been associated, at least in perception, with the kind of aristocratic intellectual culture that had produced the 30. He had consistently been skeptical of democracy as a system, arguing that governance was a skill that required knowledge, just as medicine was a skill that required knowledge, and that you would not want untrained people voting on medical questions any more than on political questions. He had not hidden this skepticism. It was genuinely threatening to a democratic city trying to rebuild its confidence. The trial of 399 BCE, a defense that was not trying to win. The trial of Socrates is one of the most consequential events in intellectual history, and not primarily because of its outcome, though the outcome was consequential enough. It is most consequential because of how Socrates conducted his defense, and what that defense reveals about the philosophical commitments that determined how he lived. 500 Athenian citizens served as jurors, chosen by lot in the democratic fashion. Both sides spoke. Then the jury voted. Socrates was found guilty by a margin of roughly 280 to 220, a relatively narrow majority, narrower than many scholars would have expected given the general mood of the city. The narrow margin suggests that a significant portion of the jury was sympathetic to him, or at least uncertain, and that a more conciliatory defense speech might have tipped the balance. Socrates had not given a conciliatory defense speech. He had given the speech we know from Plato's Apology, which is called that because apologia in Greek means defense speech, not apology in the modern sense. And the speech was many things, but conciliatory it was not. He began by saying he would speak plainly, without rhetorical ornamentation, because he intended to say true things, and true things did not require decoration. He acknowledged his bad reputation and traced it to decades of philosophical activity, and to the distortion of that activity by Aristophanes in the clouds. He told the story of the oracle and his investigation, and his conclusion that he was wisest only in knowing his own ignorance. He described his philosophical mission as a divine assignment that he could not abandon even if the jury offered to acquit him on condition that he stop. He said that if the jury offered him life in exchange for silence, he would have to decline the offer, because the unexamined life is not worth living, and a life without philosophy for him would be the unexamined life. This is the most famous line from the Apology, and one of the most famous lines in philosophy. It is a claim of extraordinary radicalism, not that the examined life is better, not that examination is a good habit, but that a life without examination is not worth living at all, that something essential to human life is missing from it. Socrates said this at his own trial, knowing it would not help his case, because it was what he believed. He was found guilty. Then came the penalty phase. In the Athenian legal system, after a guilty verdict, both sides proposed a penalty and the jury chose between them. The prosecution proposed death. Socrates was expected to propose something serious enough to be a genuine alternative, something that might appeal to the jury as sufficient punishment. What Socrates proposed, in the initial formulation, was free meals for life at the Prytaneum, the honor given to Olympic victors and great public benefactors. He then acknowledged, with what sounds like genuine puzzlement, that he was not sure what penalty was appropriate for a man who had spent his life in service to the city at great personal sacrifice, who had never sought wealth or political power, who had made himself poor in the service of Athens's spiritual health. His friends present urged him to propose a fine. He proposed a fine, naming a figure that was too small and then allowing his friends to name a larger one. The jury voted for death by a larger margin than the original guilty verdict. The tone of his defense speech had offended them more than the original charges. He spent a month in prison before the execution because the Athenians were observing a sacred period during which executions were forbidden. His friends visited daily. Philosophical conversation continued as though the setting were no different from any other. His friend Crito came early one morning with a plan. The guards had been bribed. A ship was waiting. Escape was possible. Many people in Athens expected Socrates to take this opportunity. He refused. His refusal is the subject of the Crito, one of the shorter Platonic dialogues, and the argument he gives is both principled and characteristically Socratic in its willingness to follow the argument wherever it leads, even when the destination is inconvenient. He personifies the laws of Athens and imagines them speaking to him. They point out that Socrates has lived under their protection his whole life, that he chose to remain in Athens when he could have moved elsewhere, that by living under the laws he has implicitly agreed to abide by their judgments. To escape now would be to break that agreement, to put his survival above his principles, to value life over justice. And valuing life over justice was exactly the error he had spent his life arguing against. He could not now demonstrate, at the moment of maximum personal cost, that he had not meant it. The death, philosophy to the end. The day of Socrates' execution is described in the Phaedo, one of Plato's most moving dialogues, told from the perspective of a man named Phaedo who was present, and who recounts the day to a group of philosophers in another city who have heard the news and want to know what happened. The friends gathered in the prison in the morning. There were many of them, people who had known Socrates for years and who understood that this was the last day. Xanthippe, his wife, was there with their youngest son in her arms. She wept and said something about this being the last time his friends would speak with him. Socrates said to Crito, "Let someone take her home," and Crito's people led her away, weeping and beating her breast. The day was spent in philosophical conversation, as almost all the days spent with Socrates had been. The topic was the one that the circumstances made unavoidable, the immortality of the soul. Socrates argued for it with genuine intellectual engagement rather than desperate hope, presenting several arguments for why the soul was likely to survive the body's death. The soul was more akin to the forms than to physical things, and the forms were immortal. The soul was the principle of life in the body, and the principle of life could not admit its opposite, death, any more than fire could admit cold while remaining fire. The soul, having known the forms in a prior existence, must have existed before the body it now inhabited. His friends presented objections, and Socrates engaged with the objections seriously. He was not simply asserting conclusions. He was doing what he always did, examining the argument, testing it, following it as carefully as he could. He acknowledged that the arguments were not demonstratively certain. He said that if one could not be certain, it was at least reasonable to commit to the best account available and to live accordingly. At the end of the day, he bathed. He said goodbye to his wife and sons, who had come to the prison. He returned to his friends. The jailer brought the hemlock. Socrates asked about the procedure. He should walk around until his legs became heavy and then lie down. He asked whether it was permitted to pour a libation to the gods from the cup. There was probably not quite enough hemlock for that. He said, "Very well," and prayed that the transfer from this world to the next might be fortunate. He raised the cup and drank it down with perfect equanimity, without trembling, without changing color. His friends wept. He told them gently to compose themselves, that he had sent the women away so that he would not have to hear this kind of thing, for he had heard that one should die in auspicious silence. He walked around until his legs felt heavy. He lay down. The jailer pressed his foot. Did he feel that? No. He pressed his leg. Did he feel that? No. The paralysis was moving upward. He uncovered his face, which he had covered, and spoke his last words to Crito. "Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Make sure the debt is paid. Do not forget." Then he covered his face and was still. We owe a cock to Asclepius. Asclepius was the god of healing. The traditional offering to Asclepius was a cock, made in gratitude when someone recovered from illness. The last words of Socrates, which have been interpreted endlessly, most likely mean something like, "Life is the illness, death is the cure, and we should express gratitude to the god of healing for the recovery." Whether this is correct, whether Socrates was being seriously philosophical or quietly ironic, or simply pious, or some combination of all three, is the kind of question Socrates himself would have found worth examining. What he believed, the examined life and its requirements. Reconstructing Socrates' actual beliefs is genuinely difficult because he wrote nothing, and his two most important sources, Plato and Xenophon, represent him differently in important ways. But certain convictions appear consistently enough across the sources that we can treat them as reasonably reliable. The care of the soul was his central and governing conviction. The soul, psyche in Greek, was for Socrates the rational and moral center of the person, the seat of wisdom and virtue, and the capacity for genuine understanding. He believed that caring for the soul was more important than anything else, more important than wealth, more important than reputation, more important than political power, more important than physical comfort or safety, or even life itself. You could damage a person by unjustly harming their body or their property, but you did far greater damage by corrupting their soul or allowing it to become corrupt through injustice and ignorance. And you could benefit a person enormously, could do the greatest possible service to them, not by giving them money or influence, but by helping them toward genuine understanding of the good. This conviction about the soul explained his attitude toward his own death. He genuinely did not know whether death was bad. It might be a dreamless sleep, in which case it was simply nothingness, and nothingness was not something to fear since there was no one there to experience it badly. It might be a passage to another existence where philosophical conversation could continue with the great minds of all ages. Either way, it was not certain that death was bad, and since he did not know that it was bad, he was not going to compromise his principles to avoid it. This was not bravado. It was the logical consequence of his commitment to honest uncertainty applied to the specific question of his own survival. He believed in self-knowledge, the injunction "Know thyself" that was inscribed at Delphi. To know yourself meant to understand what you actually knew and what you did not know, to be clear-eyed about your own capacities and limitations and tendencies, to avoid the false certainty that he found everywhere in Athens. This self-knowledge was not easy or natural. It required the hard work of examination. It required the willingness to have one's assumptions questioned and found inadequate. It required the intellectual humility to sit with not knowing rather than reaching for a comfortable answer. It was the foundation of genuine wisdom, and its absence was the foundation of everything that went wrong in human life. He believed in the unity of virtue, that courage and justice and piety and wisdom and temperance were not separate and independent qualities, but aspects of a single underlying thing, knowledge of the good. A person who truly understood the good would manifest all the virtues, because the virtues were just different expressions of that understanding in different situations. This is a controversial doctrine, and Plato works through its difficulties carefully in various dialogues. But it follows naturally from the conviction that virtue is knowledge. If virtue is knowing what is truly good, then there is ultimately one thing to know, and knowing it fully would express itself as all the virtues simultaneously. The legacy, what Socrates made possible. Socrates left no texts, no school, no institution, no formal students in any organizational sense. He left people, and what some of those people did with what he had given them is one of the more remarkable chains of consequence in the history of thought. Plato founded the Academy and developed the philosophical system that shaped European thought for 2,000 years. Aristotle studied at the Academy for 20 years and then developed a different but equally comprehensive system in response. The Stoics, whose philosophy of how to maintain inner freedom regardless of external circumstances, shaped Roman culture profoundly, and has had an extraordinary revival in our own time under the name Stoicism, traced their lineage to the Socratic tradition. They took Socrates' conviction that virtue alone constitutes the good life, and developed it systematically into a complete way of being in the world. The Cynics, who pushed Socratic indifference to material comfort and social convention to radical extremes, counted him as their founding inspiration. The Skeptics, who made the Socratic recognition of ignorance into a complete philosophical program, were another branch of the same root. The reach extends far beyond these formal schools. Socrates established more clearly than anyone before him the model of the intellectual as a person committed to truth-telling over social acceptability, to honest inquiry over comfortable agreement, to the examined life over the convenience of unexamined assumption. This model has recurred throughout Western culture in figures who differ from each other in almost every other way. Thomas More, who died rather than affirm what he believed to be false. Spinoza, who ground lenses rather than compromise his philosophical independence. Henry David Thoreau, who went to prison rather than pay taxes for an unjust war. Simone Weil, who refused to eat more than the occupied French ration as a form of solidarity with the suffering. These people are very different from each other and from Socrates. They are all recognizably in his lineage. The Socratic method has a life beyond academic philosophy. The law school tradition of using questions to expose the inadequacy of a student's first answer, of pushing through successive inadequate formulations toward deeper understanding, is explicitly Socratic in name and substantially Socratic in practice. Medical education increasingly uses Socratic questioning to develop clinical reasoning rather than simply imparting facts. The broader intellectual habit of defining your terms before claiming to know what you are talking about, of examining your assumptions rather than simply inheriting them, of following an argument wherever it leads rather than stopping when the destination becomes uncomfortable. All of this is Socratic, so deeply embedded in the Western intellectual tradition that we often do not see it because it has become simply the way careful thinking works. Perhaps most fundamentally, Socrates established the seriousness and the urgency of the question he spent his life asking: how ought one to live? He insisted that this question was not a matter of convention or tradition or social expectation or comfortable habit, but a genuine philosophical problem that demanded rigorous investigation and honest answers, and that getting it right or wrong made all the difference in the world to whether a life was worth living. He asked this question at great personal cost, maintained his commitment to it against every incentive to abandon it, and paid the ultimate price for the insistence. 24 centuries later, the question is still open. He would have expected nothing less. He would have been delighted. Sitting with Socrates in the dark. It is late now, and I want to end simply by sitting for a moment with who this man was without argument or analysis. He was a man who had found something worth dying for, not a cause or an ideology or a territory or a tribe, but something more interior and more permanent, the honest examination of how one ought to live. He found it and pursued it with total commitment for the rest of his long life, at great personal cost, with the clear-eyed awareness that the cost would eventually be his life, and without apparent regret. This seems both very simple and very rare. Most of us organize our lives around things we have not examined very carefully, around habits and assumptions and social expectations and inherited values that we have absorbed so thoroughly that we mistake them for ourselves. We are the prisoners in the cave who have been watching shadows for so long that the shadows seem like reality. Socrates pressed on the shadows. He pressed on them in other people, and he pressed on them in himself, and in the process became something genuinely unusual, a person who had actually examined his own life and was actually living the examined version of it, which turned out to look very different from the unexamined version. The examination led to a prison cell and a cup of hemlock, which is the part we tend to forget when we celebrate the examined life as a philosophical ideal. The city that executed him was not a city of barbarians or tyrants. It was Athens, the greatest democracy of the ancient world, a city of culture and philosophy and civic pride, and it killed him through a legal process with 500 jurors and full democratic procedure. The examined life is not safe. The gadfly does not get to choose whether the horse kicks. And yet he sat in prison the night before his death, talking with his friends about the immortality of the soul, with the cheerfulness and engagement of a man who is doing what he came to do. He drank the hemlock without trembling. He walked around until his legs were heavy and lay down. And at the very end, he remembered a small debt to a god of healing and made sure someone knew to pay it. That attention, even in the last minutes, to what was owed and what mattered, that is the examined life. That is what it looks like when it is fully lived. Sleep well. Thank you for thinking with me tonight.